Howdy, everybody. So today we're doing a short lecture on kind of social reform movements, kind of ending up with the anti-slavery abolitionist movements. So we're going to look at two major types of social reforms: communitarian reforms and humanitarian reforms. So humanitarian is whenever you're trying to improve humanity's condition. And then there are communitarian reforms, where people are trying to basically remove themselves from society and kind of live in a little commune. Not quite like hippies in the communes of the 1960s, but still live in a collective nature. So the first big humanitarian reform is called the Second Great Awakening. So that's kind of what this image is portraying. And the Second Great Awakening is this revival movement that spread across the United States kind of during the 1820s on. Now, there was a First Great Awakening, but that was mainly in England. It came over to the colonies a little bit, but this is what's really going to kind of kickstart the Second Great Awakening in the United States, a few hundred plus years later. But this is when Americans start getting reinterested in religion. So you had a very religiously focused colonies, and then you have the American Revolution where we kind of get lukewarm on religion and God and stuff like that. And this is a revival of this. So you had these preachers that went around and talked and had these big tent revivals. Everyone would worship and sing and all this kinds of stuff. And got people back into kind of God and worshiping and different religion and different versions of Christianity. What was unique about this is at these revivals, women were able to kind of lead Bible studies and talk, and they couldn't full on preach. That wasn't real socially acceptable, but they had a more public role than ever before. And that was a big change. And that's going to kind of springboard many of these women into the women's rights movement and women's suffrage later on. So this Second Great Awakening is kind of a catalyst for a lot of the stuff that follows afterwards. Then you get Horace Mann, and he's going to be a big proponent of public education. Now, he starts his first public school in Massachusetts. Massachusetts eventually adopts it and creates a public school system for their state. And slowly, many other New England states began doing this. So basically, up to a certain grade, so fifth, sixth, seventh grade became mandatory. Eventually, up through high school becomes mandatory. However, while this becomes popular and makes a lot of sense, more people are educated, better quality of life, all these kinds of things. The problem was, while it spread across the North, the South always rejected education, particularly public education, because the way you pay for public education is with tax money. Southerners didn't want to pay taxes, and furthermore, their kids didn't need to be in school. They needed to be on the farm working. So we can thank Horace Mann for our public school system today, but the South was very slow in getting it. And we'll talk about it during Reconstruction, because basically the North has to force the South to take public education, and even then they try to kill it multiple times. You have a woman named Dorothea Dix, and she is arguing for prison reform for the mentally ill. So if you had any kind of mental disorder at all, whether you were violent or not, if you had any type of mental illness, they threw you in prison. And the condition of these prisons are terrible. Even what they called insane asylums, the condition there was atrocious. So to kind of expose the living conditions for these people, Dorothea Dix actually has herself committed to one of these hospitals, lives there for a few weeks, then comes out, writes an expose on it to demonstrate to everyone how bad it was. And she starts to slow reform of both prisons and insane asylums. Now, we see prison reform time and time again throughout US history over various issues and targets and reasons, but prison reform is going to be a big deal, and we're still dealing with needs for prison reform for a variety of issues, mainly based on race. So, but we'll get to those later this semester and next semester. Now, one of the biggest movements is going to be the temperance movement. Now, temperance means to temper something, to do less of it. And this is in reference to drinking. Now, it's mainly women that are pushing for this temperance movement. And they're pushing for it because they're the brunt of the problem of drinking. Men go out and drink, they waste the money from their paycheck, they come home drunk, and they take their anger out on their wives and children. So the temperance movement thought, if we can do away with alcohol, we can do away with violence. Now, it wasn't the alcohol making the men do violence. It was a violent man losing his inebriation or his inhibitions due to inebriation that was doing the violence. So if we just taught men not to beat women, that would have been a much quicker process. But nonetheless, they blamed alcohol and liquor, so that's what they targeted. And this is going to eventually grow. It starts in the early 1800s, and by the early 1900s, we're going to get prohibition, the full outlaw of alcohol across the nation. That does not go well. That does not go the way they planned, but it's going to have dire consequences for the nation that we're still dealing with today, going back to that actual prison reform. But nonetheless, we'll get to all that as we get to it. But just know that one of the big issues for women was drinking. Now, another issue facing women is this idea of the cult of domesticity, or the cult of true womanhood. And this dictated what a true woman should be. Now, there's 4 parts to being a true woman. First, she was pious, religious, she was devout. Second, she was pure. So that means she was a virgin before marriage. Third, she was domestic. That means she worked in the home. That was her sphere of influence. Fourth, and probably the most important of all, she was submissive to her husband. Now, as we can all generally agree, most women would chafe at many of these requirements today, particularly the extent in which they were being pushed. Many women at the time chafed under them. And what the problem is, being at home, taking care of the kids, waiting for your husband to get home from work was unrealistic for most women because they actually had to work themselves just to feed their family. So while the cult of domesticity, the cult of true womanhood was this ideal, very few women could live up to it unless you were, upper middle class or wealthier. So it creates this kind of double-edged sword for women. One, they're being held up on this platform, looked up to as kind of this moral high ground. But if you don't meet that expectation, then you're a whore, you're a slut, you're trash. And the vast majority of women couldn't live up to it because they were trying to survive the world. So this is the weirdness of kind of the expectations for women during this time. Now you have this idea called coverture, where a woman legally doesn't exist outside of her relationship to a man. So when she's born, she's her father's daughter. If her father's died, she's her uncle's niece or her brother's sister. Once she gets married, she legally as property gets transferred to her husband, so she becomes her husband's wife. She does not exist as a legal entity unto herself. She only exists as in a relationship to her man. And on top of that, there's something called the rule of thumb, where a woman could be beat by her husband or father as long as he used a stick that was no wider than his thumb. So this is pretty screwed up all the way around. And you can see why women are chafing at this system. Now, there's a lot of different ways they try to fight the system. One of the more interesting ones is many women wanted the ability to wear pants, not these big dresses with hoops and all these other things. So this was one of the first kind of arguments for pants. They still pretty much look like dresses, but there's pants clearly there. Now, women wanted pants because when you're trying to manage a household, cook, clean, take care of kids, a pair of pants are way easier than a big poofy skirt, particularly with a corset that cuts off part of your breathing. So women wanted new forms of clothing, but when these first round of clothing, particularly like a more traditional pant and top, not one of these dressy ones, when women would wear these, sometimes they would even go as far as getting arrested because they weren't meeting social decorum. Now, Margaret Fuller really challenged the system at the time. She wrote a book in 1845 called Woman in the 19th Century. And she argued that many women were frustrated with the world in which they lived and maybe wanted more, maybe things like the right to vote or an education. So she wasn't asking for a wild idea, she was asking for basic rights that every man had, but she wanted them for women, which what's crazy is most white men at this point in time were more willing to give black men civil rights than to give their own wives. So this is the wild idea. So someone they're married to, they think is beneath a man of any race. So it's a very weird world that we're looking at during this time period. Now you have Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She is going to be one of the biggest proponents of women's suffrage. Now that's not women's suffering, but suffrage. Suffrage means the right to vote. So she's going to put together something known as the Seneca Falls Convention. So this is a big convention right around the time of the Mexican War, so 1848, where in Seneca Falls, New York, she and a lot of women and men get together and they talk, come up with ideas, and basically they boil it all down that women want rights. And they're going to come up with something called the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. So basically they took the American Declaration of Independence, reworded it a little bit, used the same format but changed the words a little bit, to basically say women are declaring their independence from men, and they list the grievances. Instead of the grievances against the king, it's the grievances against men, and the rights they deserve. Mainly the right to vote. If they get the right to vote, they can vote and get other rights. So this is the big push. Now this was 1848. Women don't get the right to vote till 1920. So they start the process, but it takes almost a century. It takes 80 years before it really makes a major, I guess 70 years before it makes a major change. Now, we're going to look at a couple of communitarian reforms. So you have Hopedale with Aiden Ballou. Now, while we call them communitarian reforms, these aren't communes like we think of the 1960s. While these people come and work together, they are looking for kind of a utopian vision of the world, a world without competition, a world where we can just get along, all this kinds of stuff. Now, two things you need to know about Hopedale's guiding principles. One, the cooperative principle of Christian love. So the self-sacrificing love. So we'll all love each other, we'll all get along, no conflict. Second, as far as economics were concerned, they were one entity. So everyone, whenever they joined Hopedale, all pooled their money in the middle. And whenever money was made, it was evenly distributed to everybody. This worked for a few years, but after a period of time, the people who had, whenever they first arrived, donated more money, thought they should get a bigger percentage of what came out. Capitalism worked its way into Hopedale, which was supposed to be a utopia, but capitalism eroded it, and eventually Hopedale falls apart after about a decade. You have another one called La Reunion. This is a French settlement that comes to Texas, of all places, nearby Dallas. So this was settled in 1805. And it's going to 1855. And it's going to last for about 5 years. One of the big problems for La Reunion is while they're living this utopian life, communal, working together, all this kinds of stuff, what gets them is they believe in what's called the divine spark. So everyone in God's eyes is equal. The problem of moving into the South and saying all people are equal is the South is supporting slavery at this point. So La Reunion is anti-slavery. They're abolitionists. So we have an enclave of abolitionists in the heart of Texas, which is extremely pro-slavery. These are not going to jive well, and it's eventually going to fall apart. Now, speaking of slavery, we need to look at some of the major options for slavery, like what's going to happen. We're going to have to figure something out with slavery to avoid civil war. Now we know civil war does happen because no one could agree on what the good option was. So you have kind of the most radical option, which is abolition. So people like William Lloyd Garrison and his newspaper that he published, The Liberator, are saying we need to end slavery now. There is no alternative. Black people are equals in all regards. We must make them equals and we must get rid of slavery. So William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass are the two biggest proponents of this. Now Frederick Douglass was a former slave, eventually gains his freedom, becomes a big speaker, writer about the anti-slavery and abolitionist movements, but nonetheless, this is kind of a very radical thing. Only the most extreme people kind of hold to this idea. You have another idea called gradual emancipation, which people put forth. And this is kind of Northerners trying to appease the South, say, let's ease our way out of slavery. Let's say whenever someone turns 18 or 25, they're no longer a slave. So you'll have slaves for a period, but those people gain their freedom. So over a generation or two, we'll eventually not have any more slaves. Southerners didn't like this idea. Getting rid of their slaves was not on their agenda. But people like proposing it because they felt it was a good halfway measure. So you have Benjamin Lundy propose another alternative. This is called colonization. Now this idea is both innovative and kind of racist, but it's one of the biggest ideas of the time. Now the idea comes from the concept that if you set the slaves free, which they argued that was the right thing to do, the problem was black and white people could never live together as equals in the same country. So you have to take all the newly freed slaves or former slaves and send them back to Africa. So this colonization society is actually going to purchase an entire country in Africa, what today is known as Liberia, and they're going to free several thousand slaves and drop them off in Africa. And you can imagine, this doesn't go as well as they hope. Slaves had been slaves their whole life. They hadn't been taught how to run a government. They hadn't been taught how to read, write, do all these important necessities to run a government. So it doesn't go well. It kind of hobbles along. Plus, people were already living there, but these Americans, these African Americans, who are basically American by this point, when they went over, they didn't know African languages, African cultures, so there's a lot of relearning and clash of what's going on here. Now you can kind of see the legacy persists until today. So it was established during James Monroe's presidency, so the capital is Monrovia, which is the same as today. And it kind of works, and this idea will linger on. Even Abraham Lincoln, when he's running for president, toys with the idea of of the colonization society as a form of emancipation, or as an aftermath of emancipation. He gets rid of that because of people like Frederick Douglass saying, no, that's a dumb idea. But nonetheless, this idea persists for a very long time. Another option for slavery, this is the one the Southerners always threw out, was compensation. They're like, okay, you want us to free our slaves? Yeah, totally. We would love to free our slaves. Pay us for every slave we free. Now, the government will never have enough money to do this. There's not enough taxes to go around to pay for all the slaves. Even a gradual compensation would take hundreds of years to get enough money to buy all the slaves. So this was never viable, but it was the way that Southerners could appeal to capitalism, and many people would be like, oh, well, yeah, that makes sense. We should pay them, blah, blah, blah. And they're kind of muddying the water of human lives for money. So it's not a good idea, not the right idea, but nonetheless, this is an idea they use as kind of a red herring, something to distract you from the actual issue. Then you have kind of the extreme Southern point of view. They argue slavery is legal. Because slaves are property, you can own a slave anywhere, and the Constitution protects property. So therefore, if the Constitution protects property, slaves are property, you should be able to take your property everywhere. So Northerners want to contain slavery in the Southern states. Southerners, the most extreme ones, argue that technically, under the law and Constitution, I can take my slave into any state. So it's kind of a radical point of view, and it's going to be one that kind of leads towards a civil war as both sides begin drawing lines, becoming more and more paranoid of each other. Now, the final point we'll make on this is anti-slavery versus abolitionism. So abolitionism is kind of the moral argument. Slavery is morally wrong, and we should free the slaves and treat them as equal. Anti-slavery is slightly different. Basically what they're saying is slavery is bad, And if you want to free them, that's fine. But more importantly, we don't want slavery as an institution. So black slaves competing with free white farmers. So it's less about the slave and more about the institution of slavery. So they don't want slavery coming into their state, not because they think black people should be free, but because they don't want white farmers to have to compete with slave owners or the institution of slavery. So similar end goal, but for very different reasons. Now keep in mind, the anti-slavery people wouldn't want free blacks in their state either. So anti-slavery is still racist while being against slavery. Abolitionists are not racist in the most parts, and they want equality for African Americans. So that gives you an idea of some social reforms and kind of the possible paths that slavery was going to take as it was being debated during, the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, leading up to the Civil War. But we'll stop there for today. We'll pick up with another video next time.